Today, I am going to talk about Introduction to Reinforcement Learning. In the course of first lecture, I will start with simple analogy for the reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is a part of machine learning where an agent is put in an environment, and he learns to behave in this environment by performing certain actions. Okay, so it basically performs actions, and it either gets rewards on the actions or it gets a punishment and observing the reward which it gets from those actions. Reinforcement learning is all about taking an appropriate action in order to maximize the reward in a particular situation. So guys, in supervised learning, the training data comprises of the input and the expected output. And so the model is trained with the expected output itself. Now, when it comes to reinforcement learning, there is no expected output here. The reinforcement agent decides what actions to take in order to perform a given task. In the absence of a training data set, it is bound to learn from its experience itself. Alright, so reinforcement learning is all about an agent who is put in an unknown environment. And he's going to use a hit-and-run method in order to figure out the environment and then come up with an outcome. Okay, now let's look at reinforcement learning with an analogy. So consider a scenario wherein a baby is learning how to walk. This scenario can go about in two ways. Now in the first case, the baby starts walking and makes it to the candy. The candy is basically the reward is going to get. So since the candy is the end goal, the baby's happy, it's positive. Okay, so the baby is happy, and it gets rewarded a set of candies. Now another way in which this could go is that the baby starts walking, but falls due to some hurdle in between. The baby gets hurt, and it doesn't get any candy. And obviously, the baby is sad. So this is a negative reward, okay, or you can say this is a setback. So just like how we humans learn from our mistakes by trial and error, reinforcement learning is also similar. Okay, so we have an agent, which is basically the baby and a reward, which is the candy over here, okay. And with many hurdles in between, the agent is supposed to find the best possible path to reach the reward. So guys, I hope you all are clear with the reinforcement learning. Now let's look at the reinforcement learning process. So generally, a reinforcement learning system has two main components, right? The first is an agent, and the second one is an environment. Now in the previous case, we saw that the agent was a baby, and the environment was a living room wherein the baby was crawling. Okay, the environment is the setting that the agent is acting on. And the agent represents the reinforcement learning algorithm. So guys, the reinforcement learning process starts when the environment sends a state to the agent, and then the agent will take some actions based on the observations. In turn, the environment will send the next state and the respective reward back to the agent. The agent will update his knowledge with the reward returned by the environment. And it uses that to evaluate its previous action. So guys, this loop keeps continuing until the environment sends a terminal state, which means that the agent has accomplished all his tasks, and he finally gets the reward. Okay, this is exactly what is depicted in this scenario. So the agent keeps climbing up ladders until he reaches his reward. To understand this better, let's suppose that our agent is learning to play Counter-Strike. Okay, so let's break it down. Now initially, the RL agent, which is basically the player 1, let's say it's a player 1 who's trying to learn how to play the game, okay, he collects some state from the environment, okay, this could be the first state of contest, right? Now, based on the state, the agent will take some action, okay, and this action can be anything that causes a result. So if the player moves left or right, it's also considered as an action. Okay, so initially, the action is going to be random, because obviously, the first time you pick up Counter-Strike, you're not going to be a master at it. So you're going to try with different actions, and you're just going to pick up random action in the beginning. Now the environment is going to give a new state. So after clearing that, the environment is now going to give a new state to the agent or to the player. So maybe he's crossbreeds 1, now he's in stage 2. So now the player will get a reward R1 from the environment because it cleared stage 1. So this reward can be anything. It can be additional points or coins or anything like that. Okay, so basically, this loop keeps going on until the player is dead, or reaches a destination, okay? And it continuously outputs a sequence of states, actions and rewards. So guys, this was a small example to show you how reinforcement learning process works. So you start with an initial state, and once the player clouds that state, he gets a reward. After that, the environment will give another stage to the player. And after it clears that state, it's going to get another reward, and it's going to keep happening until the player reaches his destination. Alright, so guys, I hope this is clear. Now let's move on and look at the reinforcement learning definitions. So there are a few concepts that you should be aware of while studying reinforcement learning. Let's look at those definitions over here. So first, we have the agent. Now an agent is basically the reinforcement learning algorithm that learns from trial and error. Okay. So an agent takes actions like, for example, a soldier and Counter-Strike, navigating through the game, that's also an action. Okay, if he moves left, right, or if he shoots at somebody, that's also an action. Okay, so the agent is responsible for taking actions in the environment. The environment is the world Counter-Strike game, okay, it's basically the world through which the agent moves. The environment takes the agent's current state and action as input, and it returns the agent's reward and its next state as output. Alright, next we have action. Now all the possible steps that an agent can take are called actions. So like I said, it can be moving right, left, or shooting or any of that, right. Then we have state. Now state is basically the current condition returned by the environment. So whichever state you are in, if you're in state 1, or if you're in state 2, that represents your current condition. Alright, next we have reward. A reward is basically an instant return from the environment to appraise your last action, okay, so it can be anything like coins, or it can be additional points. So basically, a reward is given to an agent after it clears the specific stages. Next, we have policy. Policy is basically the strategy that the agent uses to find out his next action based on his current state. Policy is just the strategy with which you approach the game. Then we have value. Now value is the expected long-term return with discount. So value and action value can be a little bit confusing for you right now. But as we move further, you will understand what I'm talking about. Okay. So value is basically the long-term return that you get with discount. Okay, discount, I'll explain in the further slides. Then we have action value. Now action value is also known as Q value, okay? It's very similar to value except that it takes an extra parameter, which is a current action. So basically, here you'll find out the Q value, depending on the particular action that you took. Alright, so guys, don't get confused with value and action value. We'll look at examples in the further slides and you will understand this better. Okay, so guys, make sure that you're familiar with these terms, because you will be seeing a lot of these terms in the further slides. Alright. Now, before we move any further, I'd like to discuss a few more concepts. Okay, so first, we'll discuss the reward maximization. So if you haven't already realized the basic aim of the RL agent is to maximize the reward. Now, how does that happen? Let's try to understand this in depth. So the agent must be trained in such a way that he takes the best action so that the reward is maximum, because the end goal of reinforcement learning is to maximize your reward based on a set of actions. So let me explain this with a small game. Now in the figure, you can see there is a fox, there's some meat and there's a tiger. So our agent is basically the fox and his end goal is to eat the maximum amount of meat before being eaten by the tiger. Now since a fox is a clever fellow, he eats the meat that is closer to him, rather than the meat which is closer to the tiger. Now this is because the closer he is to the tiger, the higher his chances of getting killed. So because of this, the rewards which are near the tiger, even if they are bigger meat chunks, they will be discounted. So this is exactly what discounting means. So our agent is not going to eat the meat chunks which are closer to the tiger because of the risk. Right now, even though the meat chunks might be larger, he does not want to take the chances of getting killed. Okay, this is called discounting. Okay, this is where you discount because you improvise and you just eat the meat which are closer to you, instead of taking risks and eating the meat which are closer to your opponent. Right now the discounting of reward works based on a value called gamma. We'll be discussing gamma in our further slides. But in short, the value of gamma is between 0 and 1, okay? So the smaller the gamma, the larger is the discount value. Okay, so if the gamma value is lesser, it means that the agent is not going to explore and he's not going to try and eat the meat chunks which are closer to the tiger. Okay, but if the gamma value is closer to 1, it means that our agent is actually going to explore and it's going to try and eat the meat chunks, which are closer to the tiger. Alright, now I'll be explaining this in depth in the further slides. So don't worry if you haven't got a clear concept yet. But just understand that reward maximization is a very important step when it comes to reinforcement learning because the agent has to collect maximum rewards by the end of the game. Alright. Now let's look at another concept which is called exploration and exploitation. So exploration, like the name suggests, is about exploring and capturing more information about an environment. On the other hand, exploitation is about using the already known exploited information to heighten the rewards. So guys, consider the fox and tiger example that we discussed. Now here the fox eats only the meat chunks which are close to him, but he does not eat the meat chunks which are closer to the tiger. Okay, even though they might give him more rewards, he does not eat them. If the fox only focuses on the closest rewards, he will never eat the big chunks of meat. Okay. This is what exploitation is about. You're just going to use the currently known information. And you're going to try and get rewards based on that information. But if the force decides to explore a bit, it can find the bigger reward, which is the big chunks of meat. This is exactly what exploration is. So the agent is not going to stick to one corner. Instead, he's going to explore the entire environment and try and collect bigger rewards. Right. So guys, I hope you are clear with exploration and exploitation. Now let's look at the Markov decision process. So guys, this is basically a mathematical approach for mapping a solution in reinforcement learning. In a way, the purpose of reinforcement learning is to solve a Markov decision process. Okay, so there are a few parameters that are used to get to the solution. So the parameters include the set of actions, the set of states, the rewards, the policy that you're taking to approach the problem and the value that you get. Okay, so to sum it up, the agent must take an action to transition from a start state to the end state S. While doing so, the agent will receive a reward R for each action that he takes. So there's a series of actions taken by the agent, define the policy already defines the approach, and the rewards that are collected define the value. So the main goal here is to maximize the rewards by choosing the optimum policy. Alright, now let's try to understand this with the help of the shortest path problem. I'm sure a lot of you might have gone through this problem when you were in college. So guys, look at the graph over here. So our aim here is to find the shortest path between A and D with minimum possible cost. So the value that you see on each of these edges basically denotes the cost. So if I want to go from A to C, it's gonna cost me 15 points. Okay, so let's look at how this is done. Now, before we move on, look at the problem. In this problem, the set of states are denoted by the nodes, which is A, B, C, D. And the action is to traverse from one node to the other. So if I'm going from A to B, that's an action. Similarly, A to C, that's an action. Okay, the reward is basically the cost which is represented by each edge over here. Alright, now the policy is basically the path that I choose to reach the destination. So let's say I choose a CD. Okay, that's one policy. In order to get to D, I'm choosing a CD, which is a policy. Okay, it's basically how I'm approaching the problem. So guys, you can start off at node A, and you can take baby steps to your destination. Now, initially, you're clueless. So you can just take the next possible node which is visible to you. So guys, feel smart enough, you're going to choose it to C instead of ABCD, or ABCD. Alright, so now if you're at node C, you want to traverse to node D, you must again choose a wise path, or that you just have to calculate which path has the highest cost, or which path will give you the maximum rewards. So guys, this is a simple problem. We're just trying to calculate the shortest path between A and D by traversing through these nodes. So if I traverse from A, C, D, it gives me the maximum reward. Okay, it gives me 65, which is more than any other policy would give me. Okay, so if I go from A, B, C, D, it would be 14. When you compare this to A, C, D, it gives me more reward. So obviously, I'm going to go with ACB. Okay, so guys, with the simple problem, in order to understand how Markov decision process works. Alright, so guys, I want to ask you a question. What do you think I did here? Did I perform exploration or did I perform exploitation? Now the policy for the above example is of exploitation because we didn't explore the other nodes. Okay, we just selected 3 nodes, and we traversed through them. So that's why this is called exploitation. We must always explore the different nodes so that we can find a more optimal policy. But in this case, obviously ACD has the highest reward, and we're going with ECD. But generally, it's not so simple. There are a lot of nodes. There are hundreds of nodes to traverse. And there are like 5,060 policies. Okay, 5,060 different policies. So you make sure you explore through all the policies and then decide on an optimum policy, which will give you a maximum reward for a robot. An environment is a place where it has been put to use. Now remember, this reward is itself the agent. For example, an automobile factory where a reward is used to move materials from one place to another. Now the task we'll discuss just now have a property in common. Now, these tasks involve an environment and expect the agent to learn from the environment. Now, this is where traditional machine learning fails, and hence the need for reinforcement learning. Now, it is good to have an established overview of the problem that is to be solved using the Q-learning or the reinforcement learning. So it helps to define the main components of a reinforcement learning solution, that is the agent, environment, action reports and states. So let's suppose we had to pay a few autonomous robots for an automobile building factory. Now these robots will help the factory personnel by conveying them the necessary parts that they would need in order to build the car. Now these different parts are located at 9 different positions within the factory warehouse. The car part include the chassis, wheels, dashboard, the engine and so on. And the factory workers have prioritized the location that contains the body or the chassis to be the top post. But they have provided the priorities for other locations as well, which we will look into the moment that these locations within the factory look somewhat like this. So as you can see, here, we have L1, L to L3, all of these stations. Now one thing you might notice here that there are little obstacles present in between the locations. So L6 is the top priority location that contains the chassis for preparing the car bodies. Now the task is to enable the robots so that they can find the shortest route from any given location to another location on their own. Now, the agents in this case are the robots. The environment is the automobile factory warehouse. Let's talk about the states. The states are the location in which a particular robot is present in a particular instance of time, which will denote its states. Machines understand numbers rather than letters. So let's map the location codes to number. So, as you can see, here, we have mapped location L1 to the state 0, L2, and 1, and so on. We have Elliot as state 7, and airline at state 8. Next, what we're talking about are the actions. So in our example, the action will be the direct location that the robot can call from a particular location, right? Consider a robot that is at L2 location, and the direct locations to which it can move L5, L1, and L3. Now, the figure here may come in handy to visualize this. Now, as you might have already guessed, the set of actions here is nothing but the set of all possible states of the robot. For each location, the set of actions that a robot can take will be different. For example, the set of actions will change if the robot is in L1 rather than L2. So if the robot is in L1, it can only go to L4 and L2 directly. Now that we are done with the states and the actions, let's talk about the rewards. So the states are basically L1, 2, 3, 4. And the actions are also A1, 2, 3, 4 up to 8. But the rewards now will be given to a robot if a location which is the state is directly reachable from a particular location. So let's take an example. Suppose N-line is directly reachable from LA, right? So if a robot goes from LA to LA, and vice versa, it will be rewarded by 1. And if a location is not directly reachable from a particular equation, we do not give any reward, the reward of 0. Now the reward is just a number and nothing else. It enables the robots to make sense of the moment, helping them in deciding what locations are directly reachable and what are not. With this cue, we can construct a reward table, which contains all the reward values mapping between all possible states. So, as you can see here in the table, the positions which are marked green have a positive reward. And as you can see, here, we have all the possible rewards that a robot can get by moving in between the different states. Now comes an interesting decision. Now remember that the factory administrator prioritized L6 to be the topmost. So how do we incorporate this fact in the above the table? This is done by associating the top priority location with a very high reward than the usual ones. So let's put 999 in the cell L6, L6. Now the table of rewards with the higher reward for the topmost location looks something like this. We have not formally defined all the vital components. For the solution we are aiming for the problem discussed now, you will shift gears a bit and study some of the fundamental concepts that prevail in the world of reinforcement learning and Killen. First of all, we'll start with the Bellman equation. Consider the following square of rooms, which is analogous to the actual environment from our original problem but without the barriers. Now suppose a robot needs to go to the room marked in the green promised current position using the specified direction. Now how can we enable the robot to do this programmatically? One idea would be introduce some kind of a footprint which the robot will be able to follow. Now here a constant value is specified in each of the rooms which will come along the robot's rate if it follows the direction specified above. In this way, if it starts at location A, it will be able to scan through this cost and value and will move accordingly. But this will only work if the direction is prefixed and the robot always starts at location A. Consider the robot starts at this location rather than its previous one. Now the robot now sees footprints into different directions. It is therefore unable to decide which way to go in order to get the destination, which is the green drum. It happens primarily because the robot does not have a way to remember the directions to proceed. So our job now is to enable the robot with a memory. Now this is where the Bellman equation comes into play. So as you can see here, the main reason of the Bellman equation is to enable the reward with the memory. That's the thing we're going to use. The equation goes something like this: V of S gives maximum of a R of S comma plus gamma of Vs dash, where S is a particular state, which is a row. A is the action moving between the rooms. S dash is the state to which the robot goes from S, and gamma is the discount factor. But we'll get into it in a moment. And obviously, R of S comma is a reward function, which takes a state S and action and outputs the reward. Now V of S is the value of being in a particular state, which is the footprint. We consider all the possible actions and take the one that yields the maximum value. Now there is one constraint, however, regarding the value footprint, that is the row marked in yellow just below the green room. It will always have the value of 1 to denote that is one of the nearest room edges into the green room. This is also to ensure that a robot gets a reward when it goes from a yellow room to the green room. Let's see how to make sense of the equation which we have here. So let's assume a discount factor of 0.9. As remember, gamma is the discount value, or the discount factor. So let's take 0.9. Now for the room, which is much just below the one or the other room, which is the asterisk mark for this room, what will be the V of S, that is the value of being in a particular state. So for this V of S would be something like maximum of it will take 0, which is the initial of our S comma plus 0.9, which is gamma into 1, that gives us 0.9. Now here, the robot will not get any reward for going to a state marked in yellow. Hence, the RS comma is 0 here, for the robot knows the value of being in the yellow room. Hence, we have S dash is 1. Following this for the other states, we should get 0.9. Then again, if we put 0.9 in this equation, we get 0.81, then 0.79. And then we again reached the starting point. So this is how the table looks with some value footprints computed from the Bellman equation. A couple of things to notice here is that the max function helps the robot to always choose the state that gives it the maximal value of being in that state. Now the discount factor gamma notifies the robot about how far it is from the destination. This is typically specified by the developer of the algorithm that would be installed in the robot. Now the other states can also be given the respective values in a similar way. So as you can see here, the boxes adjacent to the green one have 1. And if we move away from 1, we get 0.9, 0.81, 0.7 to 9. And finally, we reach 0.66. Now the robot now can proceed its way through the green room utilizing these valid footprints even if it's stopped at any given location. Now if a robot lands up in the highlighted sky blue area, it will still find the options to choose from. But eventually, either of the paths will be good enough for the robot to take because of the way the valid footprints are laid out. Now one thing to note is that the Bellman equation is one of the key equations in the world of reinforcement learning and Q-learning. So if we think realistically, our surroundings do not always walk in the way we expect, there is always a bit of stochasticity involved in it. But this applies to robot as well. Sometimes it might so happen that the robot's machinery got corrupted, sometimes the robot may come across some hindrance on its way, which may not be known to it beforehand, right? And sometimes, even if the robot knows that it needs to take the right turn, it will not. So how do we introduce the stochasticity in our case? Now here comes the Markov decision process, because the robot is currently in the red room and it needs to go to the green room. Now let's consider the robot has a slight chance of dysfunctioning and might take the left or the right or the bottom turn instead of being the upper turn in order to get to the green room from where it is now, which is the retro. Now the question is, how do we enable the robot to handle this mantis out in the given environment, right? Now, this is a situation where the decision-making regarding which turn is to be taken is partly random and partly under the control of the robot. Now partly random because we are not when exactly the robot mind is functional, and partly under the control of the robot, because it is still making a decision of taking a turn right on its own, and with the help of the program embedded into it. So a Markov decision process is a discrete time stochastic control process. It provides a mathematical framework for modeling decision-making in situations where the outcomes are partly random and partly under the control of the decision-maker. Now, we need to give this concept a mathematical shape, most likely an equation which then can be taken further. Now, you might be surprised that we can do this with the help of the Bellman equation with a few minor tweaks. So if we have a look at the original Bellman equation, we have x is equal to a maximum of our s comma plus gamma v of s dash. What needs to be changed in the above equation, so that we can introduce some amount of randomness here. As long as we are not sure when the robot might not take the expected turn, we are then also not sure in which room it might end up in, which is nothing but the room it moves from its current drum. At this point, according to the equation, we are not sure of this stash, which is the next state towards zero, but we do know all the proper terms that are what might take. Now in order to incorporate each of those probabilities into the equation, we need to associate a probability with each of the turns to quantify the reward, if it has got any x% chance of taking the stone. Now, if we do so, we get PS is equal to a maximum of our s comma plus gamma into submission of s dash bs comma a comma s dash into v of s dash. Now, the PSA enter dash is the probability of moving from s to s dash with the action A. And the submission here is the expectation of the situation that the robot incurs, which is the randomness. Now let's take a look at this example here. So when we associate the probabilities to each of these stones, we essentially mean that there is an 80% chance that the robot will take the upper turn. Now if you put all the required values in our equation, we get v of s is equal to maximum of r of s comma plus gamma of 0.8 into v have room up plus 0.1 into v or from down 0.03 into realm of v or from left plus 0.03 into v or from right. Now note that the value footprints will not change due to the fact that we are incorporating stochastically here, but this time, we will not calculate those value footprints. Instead, we will let the robot figure it out. Now, up until this point, we have not considered about rewarding the robot for its action of going into a particular room. We are only rewarding the robot when it gets to the destination. Now ideally, there should be a reward for each action the robot takes to help it better assess the quality of the actions, but the roles need not to be always be the same. But it is much better than having some amount of reward for the actions than having no rewards at all, right? And this idea is known as the living penalty. In reality, the reward system can be very complex, and particularly modeling sparse rewards is an active area of research in the domain of reinforcement learning. So by now we have got the equation which you have. So what we're going to do is now transition to Q-learning. So this equation gives us the value of going to a particular state, taking the stochasticity of the environment into account. Now we have also learned very briefly about the idea of living penalty, which deals with associating each move of the robot with the reward. Secure learning process is an idea of assessing the quality of an action that is taken to move to a state rather than determining the possible value of the state which is being moved to. So earlier we had 0.8 into v of s1 0.03 into v of s2 0.1 into view of history and so on. Life incorporate the idea of assessing the quality of the action for moving to a certain state. So the environment with the agent and the quality of the action will look something like this. So instead of 0.8 v of s1 we'll have q of s1, 1 will have q of s2, 2. Q of S3 robot now has 4 different states to choose from. And along with that there are 4 different actions also for the current state it is in. So how do we calculate Q of S, A? That is the cumulative quality of the possible actions the robot might take. So let's break it down. From the equation V of S equals maximum of ARS comma plus comma summation S dash BS S dash into V of S dash. If we discard the maximum function, we have S v plus comma into summation P and V. Essentially, in the equation that produces V of S, we are considering all possible actions and all possible states from the current state that the robot is in. And then we are taking the maximum value caused by taking a certain action. And the equation produces a value footprint, which is for just one possible action. In fact, we can think of it as the quality of the action. So, Q of S comma A is equal to Rs comma plus comma of summation B and V. Now that we have got an equation to quantify the quality of a particular action, we are going to make a little adjustment in the equation. We can now say that we have S as the maximum of all the possible values of Q of S comma A, right? So, let's utilize this fact and replace V of S dash as a function of Q. So, Qs comma becomes R of S comma plus gamma of summation BSS dash and maximum of the Qs dash A dash. So, the equation of V is now turned into an equation of Q, which is the equality. But why would we do that? Now, this is done to ease our calculations because now we have only one function Q, which is also the core of the dynamic programming language. We have only one function Q to calculate, and R of S comma A is a quantified metric which produces reward of moving to a certain state. Now, the qualities of the actions are called the Q values. And from now on we'll refer to the value footprints as a Q values. An important piece of the puzzle is the temporal difference. Now, temporal difference is the component that will help the robot calculate the Q values with respect to the changes in the environment. What time to consider our robot is currently in the mark state and it wants to move to the upper state. One thing to note that here is that the robot already knows the Q value of making the action that is moving to the upper state. And we know that the environment is stochastic in nature and the reward that the robot will get after moving to the upper state might be different from an earlier observation. So, how do we capture this change, the real difference? We calculate the new Qs comma with the same formula and subtract the previously known QSA from it. So, this will in turn give us the new QA. The equation that we just arrived gives a temporal difference in the Q values, which further helps to capture the random changes in the environment which may impose. Now the new Qs comma is updated as following. So, Qt of S comma is equal to Qt minus 1 S comma plus alpha T dt of a comma S. Now, here alpha is the learning rate which controls how quickly the robot adapts to the random changes imposed by the environment. The Qts comma is the current state Q value and Qt minus 1 S comma is a previously recorded Q value. So, if we replace the TDS comma with its full form equation, we should get Qt of S comma is equal to Qt minus 1 of S comma plus alpha into R of S comma plus comma maximum of Qs dash A dash minus Qt minus 1 S comma A. Now that we have all the little pieces of Q lined together, let's move forward with implementation path. Now, this is the final equation of Q learning, right? So, let's see how we can implement this and obtain the best path for any robot to take. Now,
supervised learning, where a teacher gives an AI answers to learn from, and unsupervised learning, where an AI tries to find patterns in the world. Reinforcement learning is particularly useful for situations where we want to train AIs to have certain skills we don't fully understand ourselves. For example, I'm pretty good at walking, but trying to explain the process of walking is kind of difficult. What angle should your femur be relative to your foot? And should you move it with the average angular velocity of... yeah, never mind. It's really difficult. With reinforcement learning, we can train AIs to perform complicated tasks. But unlike other techniques, we only have to tell them at the very end of the task if they succeeded, and then ask them to tell us how well they did. We're going to focus on this general case, but sometimes this feedback could come earlier. So, if we want an AI to learn to walk, we give them a reward if they're both standing up and moving forward, and then figure out what steps they took to get to that point. The longer the AI stands up and moves forward, the longer it's walking, and the more reward it gets. So, you can kind of see how the key to reinforcement learning is just trial and error over and over again. For humans, a reward might be a cookie or the joy of winning a board game. But for an AI system, a reward is just a small positive signal that basically tells it, good job, and do that again. Google DeepMind got some pretty impressive results when they used reinforcement learning to teach virtual AI systems to walk, jump, and even duck under obstacles. It looks kinda silly, but works pretty well. Other researchers have even helped real-life robots learn to walk. Seeing the end result is pretty fun and can help us understand the goals of reinforcement learning. But to really understand how reinforcement learning works, we have to learn new language to talk about these AI and what they're doing. Similar to previous episodes, we have an AI, or agent, that is our loyal subject that's going to learn. An agent makes predictions or performs actions, like moving a tiny bit forward or picking the next best move in a game. And it performs actions based on its current inputs, which we call the states. In supervised learning, after each action, we would have a training label that tells our AI whether it did the right thing or not. We can't do that with reinforcement learning because we don't know what the right thing actually is until it's completely done with the task. This difference actually highlights one of the hardest parts of reinforcement learning, called credit assignment. It's hard to know which actions helped us get to the reward and should get the credit, and which actions slow down our AI when we don't pause to think after every action. So the agent ends up interacting with its environment for a while, whether that's a game board, a virtual maze, or real-life kitchen, and the agent takes many actions until it gets a reward, which we give out when it wins a game or gets that cookie jar from that really tall shelf. Then, every time the agent wins or succeeds at its task, we look back on the actions it took and slowly figure out what game states were helpful and which ones weren't. During this reflection, we're assigning value to those different game states and deciding on a policy for which actions work best. We need values and policies to get anything done in reinforcement learning. Let's say I see some food in the kitchen. A box, a small bag, and a plate with a donut. So my brain can assign each of these a value, a numerical yumminess value. The box probably has 6 donuts in it. The bag probably has 2. And the plate just has 1, so the values I assign are 6, 2, and 1. Now that I've assigned each of them a value, I can decide on a policy to plan what action to take. The simplest policy is just to go to the highest value, that box of possibly 6 donuts. But I can't see inside of it, and it could be a box of bagels, so it's high risk, high reward. Another policy could be low reward, but low risk, going with the plate with 1 guaranteed delicious donut. Personally though, I'd pick a middle ground policy and go for the bag because I have a better chance of guessing that there are donuts inside a bag than the box, and a value of 1 donut just isn't enough. That's a lot of vocab. So let's see these concepts in action. Our example is going to focus on a mathematical framework that could be used with different underlying machine learning techniques. Let's say John Greenbot wants to go to the charging station to recharge his batteries. In this example, John Greenbot is a brand new agent, and the room is the environment he needs to learn about. From where he is now in the room, he has 4 possible actions: move up, down, left, or right. And his state is a couple of different inputs: where he is, where he came from, and what he sees. For this example, we'll assume John Greenbot can see the whole room. So when he moves up, or any direction, his state changes. But he doesn't yet know if moving up was a good idea, because he hasn't reached the goal. So go on, John Greenbot, explore. He found the battery, so he got a reward, that little +1. Now, we can look back at the path he took and give all the cells he walked through a value, specifically a higher value for those near the goal and a lower for those further away. These higher and lower values help with the trial and error of reinforcement learning, and they give our agent more information about better actions to take when he tries again. So, if we put John Greenbot back at the start, he'll want to decide on a policy that maximizes reward. Since he already knows the path to the battery, he'll walk along that path and he's guaranteed another +1. But that's too easy and kind of boring if John Greenbot just takes the same long winding path every time. So another important concept in reinforcement learning is a trade-off between exploitation and exploration. Now that John Greenbot knows one way to get the battery, he could just exploit his knowledge by always taking the same 10 actions. It's not a terrible idea. He knows he won't get lost and he'll definitely get a reward. But this 10 action path is also pretty inefficient. There are probably more efficient paths out there. So exploitation may not be the best strategy. It's usually worth trying lots of different actions to see what happens, which is a strategy called exploration. Every new path that John Greenbot takes will give him a bit more data about the best ways to get a reward. So let's let John Greenbot explore for 100 actions, and after he completes a path, we'll update the values of the cells he's been to. Now, we can look at these new values. During exploration, John Greenbot found a shortcut, so he knows a path that only takes 4 actions to get to the goal. This means our new policy, which always chooses the best value for the next action, will take John Greenbot down this faster path to the target. That's much better than before, but we paid a cost. Because during those 100 actions of exploration, he took some paths that were even more inefficient than the first 10 action path, and only got a total of 6 points. If John Greenbot had just exploited his knowledge of that first path for those 100 actions, he could have made it to the battery 10 times and gotten 10 points. So you could say that exploration was a waste of time. But if we started a new competition between the new John Greenbot, who knows a 4 action path, and his younger, more foolish self, who knows a 10 action path, over 100 actions, the new John Greenbot will be able to get 25 points because his path is much faster. His reinforcement learning helped. So, should we explore more to try and find an even better path? Or should we just use exploitation right away to collect more points? In many reinforcement learning problems, we need a balance of exploration and exploitation, and people are actively researching this trade-off. These kinds of problems can get even more complicated if we add different rewards, like a +1 battery and a +3 bigger battery. Or there could even be negative rewards that John Greenbot needs to learn to avoid, like this black hole. If we let John Greenbot explore this new environment using reinforcement learning, sometimes he falls into the black hole. So the cells will end up having different values than the earlier environment, and there could be a different best policy. Plus, the whole environment can change in many of these problems. If we have an AI in our car helping us drive home, the same road will have different people, bicycles, cars, and black holes on it every day. There might even be construction that completely reroutes us. This is where reinforcement learning problems get even more fun, but much harder. When John Greenbot was learning how to navigate on that small grid, cells closer to the battery had higher values than those further away. But for many problems, we want to use a value function to think about what we've done so far and decide on the next move using math. For example, In this situation where an AI is helping us drive home, if we're optimizing safety and we see the brake lights of the car in front of us, it's probably time to slow down. But if we saw donuts in the street, we would want to stop. So reinforcement learning is a powerful tool that's been around for decades, but a lot of these problems need a ton of data and a ton of time to solve. There have been really impressive results recently thanks to deep reinforcement learning on large-scale computing. These systems can explore massive environments in a huge number of states, leading to results like AIs learning to play games. At the core of a lot of these problems are discrete symbols, like a command for forward or the squares on a game board. So how to reason and plan in these spaces is a key part of AI.